Hey everybody, Vance from the Gleemen here. Welcome back to another WoT Quickie. So today I want to talk about a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and that is specifically the subject of Perrin and Faile's marriage. Vance, that's one of the worst things in the series. We hate Faile. Perrin is so boring. Why would you enjoy this aspect of the series? They seem toxic. I'm going to explain throughout this video why I think Perrin and Faile are a little bit misrepresented in the WoT community, and bring up some points that are very important to consider when analyzing these two characters and their relationship. Ultimately, I believe Perrin and Faile have a relatively realistic representation of a marriage of two very young individuals that is taken through the lens and talked about by now relatively mature readers. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. And the perspective I want to look at this from is from an intercultural marriage perspective. What's an intercultural marriage? Well, it is when someone from one culture marries a person from another culture. In the States, we typically conflate this with the term interracial marriage, though they're not 100% interchangeable. They do have a lot of overlap. First point, and full disclosure, I'm a member of an intercultural marriage. My wife is from South Korea, native born and raised. Korean is her first language. That's one of the reasons that I find Perrin and Faile compelling, because I see a little bit of us represented in them. It's not 100%, obviously. There are things that don't translate well, like the fact that Faile always wants shouting matches with Perrin. My wife hates shouting, and she hates it when people get loud and raise their voice, so that would never fly in my house. However, I mean, maybe some people like that. Who are we to judge? I do think that this is an oft overlooked point in their marriage, that they are from two separate cultures. We do take it for granted that they're from the Westlands, and that because of that, they have a relatively unified, overarching culture where they have this relationship. All nations have this relationship with the White Tower, and they all kind of know about each other. It is brought up, like, I'm not saying people don't talk about it, but I do think it gets glossed over in a lot of scenarios and discussions, because maybe people talking about it don't have the specific frame of reference to analyze it. So they just look at this intercultural marriage and they apply possibly their intracultural marriage, where they've married a member of the same culture and they don't see the same struggles and problems that Perrin and Faile have. Another thing I want to bring up is that Chaldean culture is not particularly well represented within the series, and compared to some other cultures such as Andorran, Cairhienin, Tyran, and Altaran. Even Tarabonner culture is a little bit more represented than Chaldea. We don't get to Chaldea until the end of the series. We only have about 4 or 5 pretty main characters that we can see the Chaldean cultural lens through. Our primary one is Faile. Our secondary one is her father, who doesn't get, I don't recall if he gets any POVs, but I'd have to go look that up. I don't think Davram Bashir gets very many. Then we have Taim, who is hardly culturally Chaldean at all, because he's Taim. You'll know when you get there, readers. And Sheriam. Sheriam is hardly a Chaldean cultural lens, because she's an Aes Sedai, and she's fully embraced the tower as her culture. You could also argue that Faile's mother and Bashir's wife gives us a little bit more insight into the Chaldean culture. However, she's very minimal, and we don't get a lot of interaction with her outside of when she meets Perrin, and then when we see her on screen with Davram Bashir. That's about all the exposure from her we get. Now, we do get some, not saying we don't get any, but it's not to the degree we get through Faile. Leads me into the next prep point I want to talk about. When we meet Faile, she's 17 years old. She's a kid. Like, she has probably, I mean, she has a good idea of her culture, like in terms of, like, she knows how to act and she knows how to behave, but it's not really until we as humans age into about our mid-20s that I think we truly begin to understand why our cultures are the way they are, and what our place in them truly is, right? Like, now Faile is relatively mature for her age, because she's been groomed for a political marriage her entire life, but that doesn't change the fact that she's still young and she's still a little naive, and she may have some misconceptions about her own culture just from viewing, just from looking outside of a marriage perspective in on possibly her parents or any of her extended family. And before I started this video, I did go ahead and pull out the companion just to take a look at Saldea. And when I got in there, I noticed that we don't have, there's not a ton on specifically Saldean culture. There's a lot of facts about Saldea. There's, you know, a lot of details about exports and their horsemanship. But in terms of their culture and their marriages, there was a small paragraph in there, and all it really said was that wives prefer a husband who can stand toe-to-toe in a shouting match with them, aka they prefer strong men who don't back down. That said, they don't put up with abuse and they don't put up with browbeating. So there's that. But I mean, it was like a 2-sentence paragraph out of the entirety of the Wheel of Time companion. So as you can see, this is a hefty book, just like everything else in the series, and that's all I was able to find. So moving on into point number 1, which I kind of touched on a little earlier. I think it's often we forget that Perrin and Faile marry when they're young. By the time they get married in book 4, Perrin is 21 and Faile is 18. So that's young by modern standards. But looking at my own life, it's not too far off. I was 23 and my wife was 21 when we got married. So we weren't very far off, but we had been in college. You know, we had been holding jobs and living on our own. Not saying that Perrin and Faile haven't had, you know, experiences that possibly make them mature, but they're a little bit younger than we were, and they don't quite have the same level of education that we had. Granted, the educational gap between Perrin and Faile is large because Faile is noble-born and Perrin's a commoner. So Faile probably has him beat on the book learning there. Okay, so the next point in this video is that Perrin and Faile each have relatively limited cultural knowledge of each other. Basically, they are not going to know a whole lot about what each other's home is like, what the people are like, what the customs are like, though Faile may have a little bit of a head start on Perrin on this, given she's noble-born. You're going to see me circling back to her having a little bit more education than Perrin over and over and over. That said, Perrin's by no means, you know, unintelligent. He's very smart. He's a skilled blacksmith, and he can read and has read several books. So he's not completely ignorant of the world outside. But the Two Rivers, as we know, tends to be very inward-looking and inward-focused. So until he left, he really is not going to have much exposure outside of what he's read in books. Faile, on the other hand, she's probably at least traveled, if not to another country, to other large cities within Saldea possibly, or, you know, between where her parents rule and maybe some country estates, encountering different peoples along the way. She's probably interacted with merchants. So that said, there's probably not many merchants from the Two Rivers, so she's not going to have a good idea of what Two Rivers people are like. General Andorans, yes, but Two Rivers folk, not so much. Just to bring it on back, Perrin and Faile are going to have some cultural roadblocks. And this is very common when two people from two separate cultures enter into a relationship. There's a learning curve there. This learning curve does not take days, does not take weeks, months, but years. For my wife and I, I'm going to estimate it probably took us about 4.5 years before we really stopped hitting major cultural roadblock in the relationship. And now there's just minor stuff like she'll do something. She's like, oh well, you know, it's like a Korean thing. I'm like, oh well, okay, whatever. Or I'll do something. She's like, well, I didn't know that. I'm like, yeah, it's pretty weird or cool, isn't it? She's like, yeah, it is. So you constantly find things like that. And we've been married now for 8 years, and we still sometimes find a little nugget of hidden culture that we don't think about actively in our heads, but then it just comes out passively. And yeah, it's an interesting experience. The next point I want to talk about is that Perrin can smell how Faile feels. Heaping that on top of the cultural differences that they already have, Perrin knows how Faile feels at every single moment when she's within smelling distance. This throws her off because in a lot of these situations where he immediately after like an audience with somebody or a meeting will, you know, go to her and be like, I know you're mad, or I know you're jealous, and that like throws her off guard because she's trying to keep this stately mask on in order to keep up the appearance, so that way they can deal with this in private later. So I feel like when Perrin does that to Faile, it breaks down this mask and it just leaves her a little exposed, and it hurts her pride a little bit. I mean, keep in mind that we constantly, while we always appreciate a partner who is very intuitive and can kind of anticipate what we're thinking, if it goes to an extreme, it becomes a little unsettling and a little creepy. All right, and bringing it back on to more Perrin-centric focused right now, we do see this relationship through Perrin's eyes more than we do Faile's. I think this is part of the reason that people have a hard time empathizing with Faile or connecting with her, because we see her so much through Perrin's perspective. And when we see this perspective, we're only getting Perrin's thoughts and feelings about it, which is his Two Rivers perspective. We're not really getting Faile's thoughts and perspective until a little bit later on in the series, but it pales in comparison to how much we have Perrin's point of view on this. I think this plays into a lot of why people are so harsh on Faile and why they think Perrin and Faile maybe aren't such a great couple. I'm not saying they're the best couple, but I'm just trying to increase some understanding of why they are the way they are. It's an interesting take on it because when we're only getting one side of the story, we tend to start to side with that one, right? And I think truly upon rereads, you can see that Faile has a little bit more going on for her, right? Like, I haven't even touched on the fact that Perrin hardly learns any Saldean customs throughout the entirety of their relationship, but Faile makes great pains to learn Perrin's culture and Perrin's customs, to the point that maybe now people are like, well, damn, Perrin, why are you being such a dick? So yeah, that's just another little note about their relationship. One side is putting in a little bit more work than the other, and one is relying on superpowers. All right, and my last point for this video that I want to make is that we tend to not focus on the goals that bring Perrin and Faile together. We see a lot of what makes us think they should be apart, but we don't really talk about their shared goals. And those shared goals come down to a couple of things. Number one is protecting people. Both Perrin and Faile have a strong protective nature to them. They take in those who are dejected and aimless and give them purpose. Faile is a little bit better at this at first than Perrin, though Perrin does kind of, as he grows in his leadership capabilities, does begin to do this as well. For Faile, we see this with the Cha Faile, who don't really have direction, don't really have anything to be striving for, and so they pledge to her, and she gives them purpose in being her eyes and ears network. With Perrin, we can see it in Autumn the Tinker and Balwer, the former spy master of the Children of the Light. So with Autumn, we see that Perrin neglects him into oblivion, and when that happens, Autumn loses his direction. When he loses his guiding light in Perrin, and specifically the pair of Perrin and Faile, he loses his way. He's roped in by Missima to attempt to assassinate Perrin during the Battle of Malden, which ultimately ends in his death. Balwer is a success story that is able to find purpose in Perrin after Pendrin Nial is killed. He eventually stumbles his way into Perrin's camp, finds employee as the spy master for Perrin, and begins a successful career there as both his chief kind of scribe and informant. We see that Perrin's ability to pull in people and give them purpose affects many, and I believe it affected Faile when she first interacted with Perrin in The Dragon Reborn. She is kind of infatuated with Perrin to the point that she rationalizes she'll be able to find the Horn of Lear if she or at least see it if she goes with Perrin and Moraine and Lan. So she tags along with them and eventually falling in love with Perrin and him with her. So I believe this is part of Perrin's Taviran nature. So again, on the note of responsibility, we see with Faile that both she and Perrin kind of have a theme of running away from it. And when we meet her in The Dragon Reborn, that's exactly what she was doing. She was running away from her responsibility in Saldea to enter into a political marriage and start becoming who she's supposed to be in terms of her upbringing and education. That's why she went down to Ilion to become a hunter of the horn. This all kind of flips on her when she meets Perrin and eventually marries him, because she then falls into that role of who she was supposed to be, right? She falls into the nobleman's wife role, the administrator of all the affairs, of all the logistics, of making sure that estates and camps and armies are running, while her husband can focus on strategy and battlefield tactics and holding up morale for the men. And I think that's part of Perrin's Ta'veren nature with Faile, and why she ends up pushing him so hard, because she knows that ultimately it's her duty as a wife to ensure that everything runs smoothly, and it can't run smoothly if their army and camp do not have the leader they expect Perrin to be. That's why I relate with Perrin and Faile a little bit. They have a similar relationship to mine in terms of it being intercultural and having roadblocks. They were young when they got married, and they have this aimlessness about them up until the Shadow Rising, at least, that they don't really know where they're going or what they're doing. But I think by the time of Fires of Heaven, Faile definitely knows what she wants and where she wants to go, but Perrin is still having that dilemma, that same dilemma we've seen from him from book 1 of the hammer or the axe, the wolf or the man, the lord or the blacksmith. Perrin has these 3 dualities that he can't reconcile, and it takes some time. And I think that having Faile actually helps him get there faster. Bringing it back around, Perrin and Faile are largely relatable to me due to my specific circumstances in life, and it has been a little disheartening to see everyone online just kind of rag on them all the time. And I think that's a lot of what I've seen has been a little bit shallow and just a little bit dismissive of the possible layers that exist within these 2 characters. I hope that this video has brought out a little bit more understanding and given you something to think about. So I want to thank everybody for watching. Go ahead and click the like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon for more Wheel of Time content, and I will catch you next time.